Misfortune by Anton Chekhov. Sophia Petrovna, the wife of Lyubyazdin's the notary, a handsome young woman of 25, was walking slowly along a track that had been cleared in the wood with Ilyin, a lawyer who was spending the summer in the neighborhood. It was 5 o'clock in the evening. Feathery white masses of cloud stood overhead. Patches of bright blue sky peeped out between them. The clouds stood motionless, as though they'd caught in the tops of the tall old pine trees. It was still and sultry. Farther on, the track was crossed by a low railway embankment on which a sentinel with a gun was for some reason pacing up and down. Just beyond the embankment there was a large white church with 6 domes and a rusty roof. "Well, I did not expect to meet you here," said Sophia Petrovna, looking at the ground and prodding at last year's leaves with the tip of her parasol. "And now I am glad we have met. I want to speak to you seriously once and for all. I beg you, Ivan Mikhailovich, if you really love and respect me, please make an end of this pursuit of me. You follow me about like a shadow. You're continually looking at me not in a nice way, making love to me and writing me strange letters, and I don't know where it's all going to end. Why, what can come of it?" Ilyin said nothing. Sophia Petrovna walked on a few steps and continued. "And this complete transformation in you all came about in the course of 2 or 3 weeks after 5 years' friendship. I don't know you, Ivan Mikhailovich." Sophia Petrovna stole a glance at her companion. Screwing up his eyes, he was looking intently at the fluffy clouds. His face looked angry, ill-humored, and preoccupied, like that of a man in pain forced to listen to nonsense. "I wonder if you don't see it yourself," Madame Lyubyazdin went on, shrugging her shoulders. "You ought to realize that it's not a very nice part that you're playing. I'm married. I love and respect my husband. I have a daughter. Can you think all this means nothing? Besides, as an old friend, you know my attitude to family life and my views as to the sanctity of marriage." Ilyin cleared his throat angrily and heaved a sigh. "Sanctity of marriage," he muttered. "Oh, Lord. Yes. I love my husband. I respect him. And in any case, I value the peace of my home. I'd rather let myself be killed than be a cause of unhappiness to Andrei and his daughter. And I beg you, Ivan Mikhailovich, for God's sake, leave me in peace. Let us be as good, true friends as we used to be, and give up these sighs and groans which really don't suit you. It's settled and over. Not a word more about it. Let us talk of something else." Sophia Petrovna again stole a glance at Ilyin's face. Ilyin was looking up. He was pale and was angrily biting his quivering lips. She could not understand why he was angry and why he was indignant, but his pallor touched her. "Oh, don't be angry. Let us be friends," she said affectionately. "Agreed? Here's my hand." Ilyin took her plump little hand in both of his, squeezed it, and slowly raised it to his lips. "I am not a schoolboy," he muttered. "I'm not in the least tempted by friendship with the woman I love." Enough. It's settled and done with. We've reached the seat. Let us sit down." Sophia Petrovna's soul was filled with a sweet sense of relief. The most difficult and delicate thing had been said. The painful question was settled and done with. Now she could breathe freely and look Ilyin straight in the face. She looked at him, and the egotistic feeling of the superiority of the woman over the man who loves her agreeably flattered her. It pleased her to see this huge, strong man with his manly, angry face and his big black beard, clever, cultivated, and people said talented, sit down obediently beside her and bow his head dejectedly. For 2 or 3 minutes they sat without speaking. "Nothing is settled or done with," began Ilyin. "You repeat copybook maxims to me. I love and respect my husband. The sanctity of marriage. I know all of that without your help, and I could tell you more too. I tell you truthfully and honestly that I consider the way I'm behaving as criminal and immoral. What more can one say than that? But what's the good of saying what everybody knows? Instead of feeding nightingales with paltry words, you'd much better tell me what I am to do." "I've told you already. Go away." "As you know perfectly well, I've gone away 5 times, and every time I turned back on the way. I can show you through my tickets. I've kept them all. I've not will enough to run away from you. I'm struggling horribly. But what the devil am I good for if I have no backbone, if I'm weak and cowardly? I can't struggle with nature. Do you understand? I cannot run away from here. She holds on to me and pulls me back. Contemptible and loathsome weakness. Ilian, flushed crimson, got up and walked up and down by the seat. "I feel as cross as a dog," he muttered, clenching his fists. "I hate and despise myself. My God, like some depraved schoolboy, I'm making love to another man's wife, writing idiotic letters and degrading myself. Oh." Ilian clutched at his head, grunted, and sat down. "And then your insincerity," he went on bitterly. "If you do dislike my disgusting behavior, why have you come here? What drew you here? In my letters, I only ask you for a direct, definite answer, yes or no. But instead of a direct answer, you contrive every day these chance meetings with me and regale me with copybook maxims." Madame Lubinstev was frightened and flushed. Suddenly felt the awkwardness with which a decent woman feels when she's accidentally discovered undressed. "You seem to suspect I'm playing with you," she muttered. "I've always given you a direct answer, and only today I've begged you." Ugh, as though one begged in such cases. "If you were to say straight out, 'Get away,' I should have been gone long ago. But you've never said that. You've never once given me a direct answer. Strange indecision, yes indeed. Either you're playing with me, or else—" Ilian leaned his head on his fists without finishing. Sophia Petrovna began going over in her own mind the ways she had behaved from beginning to end. She remembered that not only in her actions, but even in her secret thoughts, she'd always been opposed to Ilian's lovemaking. Yet she felt there was a grain of truth in the lawyer's words. But not knowing exactly what the truth was, she could not find answers to make Ilian's complaint, however hard she thought. It was awkward to be silent, and shrugging her shoulders, she said, "So I'm to blame, it appears." "I don't blame you for your insincerity," sighed Ilian. "I did not mean that when I spoke of it. Your insincerity is natural in the order of things. If people agreed together and suddenly became sincere, everything would go to the devil." Sophia Petrovna was in no mood for philosophical reflections, but she was glad of a chance to change the conversation and asked, "But why?" "Oh, because only savage women and animals are sincere. Once civilization has introduced a demand for such comforts as, well, for instance, feminine virtue, sincerity is out of place." Ilian jabbed his stick angrily into the sand. Madame Lubyanstev listened to him and liked his conversation, though a great deal of it she did not understand. What gratified her most was that she, an ordinary woman, was talked to by a talented man on intellectual subjects. It afforded her great pleasure, too, to watch the working of his mobile young face, which was still pale and angry. She failed to understand a great deal that he said, but what was clear to her in his words was the attractive boldness with which the modern man, without hesitation or doubt, decides great questions and draws conclusive deductions. She suddenly realized that she was admiring him and was alarmed. "Oh, forgive me, but I don't understand," she said hurriedly. "What makes you talk of insincerity? I repeat my request again. Be my good and true friend, and let me alone. I beg you most earnestly." "Very good. I'll try again," sighed Ilian. "Glad to do my best. Only I doubt whether anything will come of my efforts. Either I shall put a bullet through my brains or take to drink in an idiotic way. I shall come to a bad end. There's a limit to everything, to struggles with nature too. Tell me, how can one struggle against madness? If you drink wine, how are you to struggle against intoxication? What am I to do if your image has grown into my soul, and day and night stands persistently before my eyes, like that pine there at this moment? Come, tell me, what hard and difficult thing can I do to get free from this abominable, miserable condition, in which all my thoughts, desires, and dreams are no longer my own, but belong to some demon who's taken possession of me? I love you so much that I'm completely thrown out of gear. I've given up my work and all who are dear to me. I've forgotten my God. I've never been in love like this in my life." Sophia Petrovna, who had not expected such a turn to their conversation, drew away from Ilian and looked into his face in dismay. Tears came into his eyes, his lips were quivering, and there was an imploring, hungry expression in his face. "I love you," he muttered, bringing his eyes near her big, frightened eyes. "You're so beautiful. I'm in agony now, but I swear I would sit here all my life, suffering and looking in your eyes. But be silent, I implore you." Sophia Petrovna, feeling utterly disconcerted, tried to think as quickly as possible of something to say to stop him. "I'll go away," she decided. But before she had time to make a movement to get up, Ilian was on his knees before her. He was clasping her knees, gazing into her face and speaking passionately, hotly and eloquently. In her terror and confusion, she did not hear his words. For some reason now at this dangerous moment, while her knees were being agreeably squeezed and felt as though she were in a warm bath, she was trying with a sort of angry spite to interpret her own sensations. She was angry that instead of brimming over with protesting virtue, she was entirely overwhelmed with weakness, apathy, and emptiness, like a drunken man utterly reckless. Only at the bottom of her soul, a remote bit of herself was malignantly taunting her. "Why don't you go? Is this as it should be?" "Yes." Seeking for some explanation, she could not understand how it was that she did not pull away the hand to which Ilian was clinging like a leech, and why, like Ilian, she hastily glanced to right and to left to see whether anyone was looking. The clouds and the pines stood motionless, looking at them severely like old ushers seeing mischief, but bribed not to tell the school authorities. The sentry stood like a post on the embankment and seemed to be looking at the seat. "Let him look," thought Sophia Petrovna. But listen," she said at last with despair in her voice. "What can come of this? What will be the end of this?" "I don't know. I don't know," he whispered, waving off the disagreeable questions. They heard the hoarse, discordant whistle of the train. This cold, irrelevant sound from the everyday world of prose made Sophia Petrovna rouse herself. "I can't stay. It's time I was at home," she said, getting up quickly. "The train is coming in. Andrei's coming by it. He will want his dinner." Sophia Petrovna turned towards the embankment with a burning face. The engine slowly crawled by, and then came the carriages. It was not the local train as she had supposed, but a goods train. The trucks filed by against the background of the white church in a long string like the days of a man's life, and it seemed as though it would never end. But at last the train passed, and the last carriage with a guard and a light in it had disappeared behind the trees. Sophia Petrovna turned round sharply, and without looking at Ilian walked rapidly back along the track. She'd regained her self-possession. Crimson with shame, humiliated not by Ilian, no, but by her own cowardice, by the shamelessness with which she, a chaste and high-principled woman, had allowed a man and not her husband to hug to her knees. She'd only one thought now, to get home as quickly as possible to her villa, to her family. The lawyer could hardly keep pace with her. Turning from the clearing into a narrow path, she turned round and glanced at him so quickly that she saw nothing but the sand on his knees, and waved to him to drop behind. Reaching home, Sophia Petrovna stood in the middle of her room for 5 minutes without moving, and looked first at the window, and then at her writing table. "You low creature," she said, upbraiding herself. "You low creature." To spite herself, she recalled in precise detail, keeping nothing back. She recalled that through all this time she had been opposed to Ilian's love-making, something had impelled her to seek an interview with him. And what was more, when he was at her feet, she'd enjoyed it enormously. She recalled it all without sparing herself, and now, breathless with shame, she'd have liked to slap herself in the face. "Poor Andrei," she said to herself, trying as she thought of her husband to put into her face as tender an expression as she could. "Varya, my poor little girl, doesn't know what a mother she has. Forgive me, my dear ones. I love you so much, so much." And anxious to prove to herself that she was still a good wife and mother, and that corruption had not yet touched that sanctity of marriage of which she'd spoken to Ilian, Sophia Petrovna ran to the kitchen and abused the cook for not having yet laid the table for Andrei Ilyitch. She tried to picture her husband's hungry and exhausted appearance, commiserated him aloud, and laid the table for him with her own hands, which she had never done before. Then she found her daughter Varya picked up in her arms and hugged her warmly. The child seemed to her cold and heavy, but she was unwilling to acknowledge this to herself, and she began explaining to the child how good, kind, and honorable her papa was. But when Andrei Ilyitch arrived soon afterwards, she hardly greeted him. The rush of false feeling had already passed off without proving anything to her, only irritating and exasperating her by its falsity. She was sitting by the window, feeling miserable and cross. It is only by being in trouble that people can understand how far from easy it is to be the masters of one's feelings and thoughts. Sophia Petrovna said afterwards that there was a tangle within her which was as difficult to unravel as to count a flock of sparrows rapidly flying by. From the fact that she was not overjoyed to see her husband, that she did not like his manner at dinner, she concluded all of a sudden that she was beginning to hate her husband. Andrei Ilyitch, languid with hunger and exhaustion, fell upon the sausage while waiting for the soup to be brought in, and ate it greedily, munching noisily and moving his temples. "Oh my goodness," thought Sophia Petrovna. "I love and respect him, but why does he munch so repulsively?" The disorder in her thoughts was no less than the disorder in her feelings. Like all persons inexperienced in combating unpleasant ideas, Madame Lubyanstev did her utmost not to think of her trouble, and the harder she tried, the more vividly Ilyin in the sand on his knees, and the fluffy clouds, the train, they stood out in her imagination. "And why did I go there this afternoon like a fool?" she thought, tormenting herself. "And am I really so weak that I cannot depend upon myself?" Fear magnifies danger. By the time Andrei Ilyitch was finishing the last course, she'd firmly made up her mind to tell her husband everything and to flee from danger. "I've something serious to say to you, Andrei," she began her after dinner while her husband was taking off his coat and boots to lie down for a nap. "Well?" "Let us leave this place." "Where should we go? It's too soon to go back to town." No, for a tour, or something of that sort." "For a tour," repeated the notary, stretching. "I dream of that myself, but where are we to get the money? And to whom am I to leave the office?" And thinking a little, he added, "Well, of course, you must be bored. Go by yourself, if you like." Sophia Petrovna agreed, but at once reflected that Ilyin would be delighted with the opportunity, and go with her in the same train and in the same compartment. She thought and looked at her husband, now satisfied, but still languid. For some reason her eyes rested on his feet, miniature, almost feminine feet, clad in striped socks. There was a thread standing out at the tip of each sock. Behind the blind, a bumblebee was beating itself against the window pane and buzzing. Sophia Petrovna looked at the threads on the socks, listened to the bee, and pictured how she would set off. Vis-a-vis, Ilyin would sit day and night, never taking his eyes off her, wrathful at his own weakness and pale with spiritual agony. He would call himself an immoral schoolboy, would abuse her and tear his hair, but when darkness came on and the passengers were asleep or got out of the station, he would seize the opportunity to kneel before her and embrace her knees as he had at the seat in the wood. She caught herself indulging in this daydream. "Listen, I won't go alone," she said. "You must come with me." "Well, nonsense, Sofochka," sighed Lubinstev. "One must be sensible and not want the impossible." "You will come when you know all about it," thought Sophia Petrovna. Making up her mind to go at all costs, she felt that she was out of danger. Little by little her ideas grew clearer, her spirits rose, and she allowed herself to think about it all, feeling that however much she thought, however much she dreamed, she would go away. While her husband was asleep, the evening gradually came on. She sat in the drawing-room and played the piano. The greater liveliness out of doors, the sound of music, but above all the thought that she was a sensible person, that she'd surmounted her difficulties and completely restored her spirits. Other women, her appeased conscience told her, would probably have been carried off their feet in her position and would have lost their balance, while she'd almost died of shame, had been miserable, as now it was running out of the danger which perhaps did not even exist. She was so touched by her own virtue and determination that she even looked at herself 2 or 3 times in the looking-glass. When it got dark, visitors arrived. Men sat down in the dining room to play cards. The ladies remained in the drawing-room and the veranda. The last to arrive was Ilyin. He was gloomy, morose, and looked ill. He sat down in the corner of the sofa and did not move the whole evening. Usually good-humored and talkative, this time he remained silent, frowned, and rubbed his eyebrows. When he had to answer some question, he gave a forced smile with his upper lip only and answered jerkily and irritably. 4 or 5 times he made some jest, but his jests sounded harsh and cutting. It seemed to Sophia Petrovna that he was on the verge of hysterics. Only now, sitting at the piano, she recognized fully for the first time that this unhappy man was in deadly earnest, that his soul was sick, and that he could find no rest. For her sake, he was wasting the best days of his youth and his career, spending the last of his money on a summer villa, abandoning his mother and sisters, and worst of all, wearing himself out on an agonizing struggle with himself. From mere common humanity, he ought to be treated seriously. She recognized all this clearly till it made her heart ache, and if at that moment she had gone up to him and said to him, "No," there would have been a force in her voice hard to disobey. But she did not go up to him, and did not speak. Indeed, never thought of doing so. The pettiness and egoism of youth had never been more patient than in her in that evening. She realized that Ilian was unhappy, and that he was sitting on the sofa as though he were on hot coals. She felt sorry for him. But at the same time, the presence of a man who loved her to distraction filled her soul with triumph and a sense of her own power. She felt her youth, her beauty, and her unassailable virtue, and since she decided to go away, gave herself full license for that evening. She flirted, laughed incessantly, and sang with peculiar feeling and gusto. Everything delighted and amused her. She was amused at the memory of what had happened at the seat in the wood, of the sentinel who had looked on. She was amused by her guests, by Ilian's cutting jests and the pin in his cravat, which she had never noticed before. There was a red snake with diamond eyes on the pin, and the snake struck her as so amusing that she could have kissed it on the spot. Sophia Petrovna sang nervously, with defiant recklessness as though half intoxicated, and she chose sad, mournful songs which dealt with wasted hopes, the past old age as though in mockery of another's grief. And old age comes nearer and nearer, she sang. And what was old age to her? It seems as though there's something going wrong with me, she thought from time to time, through her laughter and singing. The party broke up at 12 o'clock. Ilian was the last to leave. Sophia Petrovna was still reckless enough to accompany him to the bottom step of the veranda. She wanted to tell him that she was going away with her husband, and to watch the effect this news would produce on him. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, but it was light enough for Sophia Petrovna to see how the wind played with the skirts of his overcoat and with the awning on the veranda. She could see, too, how white Ilian was, and how he twisted his upper lip in the effort to smile. "Sonia, Sonichka, my darling woman," he muttered, preventing her from speaking. "My dear, my sweet." In a rush of tenderness, with tears in his voice, he showered caressing words upon her that grew tenderer and tenderer, and even called her thou as though she were his wife or mistress. Quite unexpectedly, he put one arm around her waist, and with the other hand took hold of her elbow. "My precious, my delight," he whispered, kissing the nape of her neck. "Be sincere and come to me at once." She slipped out of his arms and raised her head to give vent to her indignation and anger. But the indignation did not come off, and all her vaunted virtue and chastity was only sufficient to enable her to utter the phrase used by all ordinary women on such occasions. "You must be mad." "Come, let us go," Ilian continued. "I felt just now, as well as at the seat in the wood, that you are as helpless as I am, Sonia. You are in the same plight. You love me, and are fruitlessly trying to appease your conscience." Seeing that she was moving away, he caught her by her lace cuff and said rapidly, "If not today, then tomorrow you'll have to give in. Why then this waste of time? My precious darling Sonia, the sentence is passed. Why put off the execution? Why deceive yourself?" Sophia Petrovna tore herself from him and darted in at the door. Returning to the drawing-room, she mechanically shut the piano, looked for a long time at the music stand, and sat down. She could not stand up nor think. All that was left of her excitement and recklessness was a fearful weakness, apathy, and dreariness. Her conscience whispered to her that she had behaved badly, foolishly that evening, like some madcap girl, that she'd just been embraced on the veranda and still had an uneasy feeling in her waist and her elbow. There's not a soul in the drawing-room. There's only one candle burning. Madame Lubyanstev sat on the round stool before the piano, motionless as though expecting something, and as though taking advantage of the darkness and her extreme lassitude, an oppressive, overpowering desire began to assail her. Like a boa constrictor, it gripped her limbs and her soul, and grew stronger every second, and no longer menaced her as it had done, but stood clear before her in all its nakedness. She sat for half an hour without stirring, not restraining herself from thinking of Ilian. Then she got up languidly and dragged herself to her bedroom. Andrei Ilyitch was already in bed. She sat down by the open window and gave herself up to desire. There was no tangle now in her head. All her thoughts and feelings were bent with one accord upon a single aim. She tried to struggle against it, but instantly gave it up. She understood now how strong and relentless was the foe. Strength and fortitude were needed to combat him, and her birth, her education, and her life had given her nothing to fall back upon. "Immortal wretch! Low creature!" she nagged at herself for her weakness. "So that's what you're like!" Her outraged sense of propriety was moved to such indignation by this weakness that she lavished upon herself every term of abuse she knew, and told herself many offensive and humiliating truths. So, for instance, she told herself she'd never been moral, that she'd not come to grief before simply because she had no opportunity, that her inward conflict during that day had all been a farce. And even if I have struggled, she thought, what sort of struggle was it? Even the woman who sells herself struggles before she brings herself to it, and yet she sells herself. A fine struggle. Like milk I've turned in a day, in one day. She convicted herself of being tempted, not by feeling, not by Ilian personally, but by sensations which awaited her. An idle lady, having her fling in the summer holidays like so many. Like an unfledged bird when the mother's been slain, sang a husky tenor outside the window. Well, if I am to go, it's time, thought Sophia Petrovna. Her heart suddenly began beating violently. Andrei, she almost shrieked. Listen, we're going, yes? Yes, I've told you already. You go alone. But listen, she began, if you don't go with me, you're in danger of losing me. I believe I'm in love already. With whom? Asked Andrei Ilyitch. Well, it can't make any difference to you who it is, cried Sophia Petrovna. Andrei Ilyitch sat up with his feet out of bed and looked wonderingly at his wife's dark figure. It's a fancy, he yawned. He did not believe her, but yet he was frightened. After thinking a little and asking his wife several unimportant questions, he delivered himself of his opinions on the family, on infidelity, spoke listlessly for about 10 minutes and got into bed again. His moralizing produced no effect. There are a great many opinions in this world, and a good half of them are held by people who've never been in trouble. In spite of the late hour, summer visitors were still walking outside. Sophia Petrovna put on a light cape, stood a little and thought a little. She still had a resolution enough to say to her sleeping husband, Are you asleep? I'm going for a walk. Will you come with me? That was her last hope. Receiving no answer, she went out. It was fresh and windy. She was conscious neither of the wind nor the darkness, but went on and on. An overmastering force drove her on, and it seemed as though if she'd stopped, it would have pushed her in the back. Immoral creature, she muttered mechanically. Low wretch. She was breathless, hot with shame, did not feel her legs under her, but what drove her on was stronger than shame, reason, or fear.